Anvil died at 0400 on the 8th day after Nima Salrath said the word aloud in a cold galley at the edge of a graveyard. 8 days, she had told Rhea Maddox, and she had been exactly right, and it took 11 seconds. There was no fire. That is what the recordings never convey, and why the footage was so hard to watch and so impossible to look away from. The last measure did not burn Anvil. It did not strike it. It reached underneath the world, into the seam beneath spacetime where every ship in the galaxy travels and where nothing living has ever been able to survive, and it collapsed that layer the way a lung collapses. And the world above simply stopped being connected to the universe. For 11 seconds, Anvil was still there. The lights were still on. The rebuilt Port Authority was still standing. 60,000 people, the ones who had held the wall, the survivors, the children who had spent 19 days in the dark, the machinists and dock workers and farmers who had taught the entire galaxy that humanity does not fold, were still alive, and they had 11 seconds to understand that the ground beneath reality itself had been taken out from under them. Then the world folded inward along a seam that should not exist, and where Anvil had been for 400 years, there was nothing. Not rubble. Not a crater. An absence, clean and quiet and complete, and the stars behind it shining through the space where 60,000 people had been standing. The Accord had not been lying about one thing. The last measure was not a weapon of destruction. It was a weapon of erasure. It did to a world exactly what the Accord had done to its own memory 10,000 years ago, and there is a terrible honesty in that, because a civilization always builds the weapon that matches its soul. 400 light-years away, Rhea Maddox watched the sensor return come in, and understood that the world she had bled for was gone, and that her daughter's last known location was a front step on a rebuilt street she had sat on herself, weeks before, promising she would be back, a room with a window, in a house belonging to a woman named Priya, on a world that no longer existed. And in the 11 seconds that followed, she would never tell anyone this, not Nima, not Oduya, not Nell. Rhea Maddox, the wall of Anvil, the conscience of her species, wanted to burn the entire galaxy down. That is where the last part of this story begins. Not with humanity's rage. With hers. They had 8 days, and they failed, and Nima Salrath had known they would fail from the 3rd hour. That was her curse. She was a reckoner. She could not stop calculating even when the number was unbearable, and the number, from the moment she and Rhea began, was this: 2 people in one unarmed Kedmer hauler, in the heart of the empty quarter, against the custodians of the Accord, with 8 days and no fleet and no authority and no way to be believed by either side. The odds were not small. The odds were 0. Nima ran it 40 times and it was 0 every time, and she did not tell Rhea, and Rhea knew anyway, because Rhea had spent 19 days on a wall doing arithmetic that came out to 0 and had never once let it decide anything. You keep running it, Rhea said, on the 4th day, watching her. I am a reckoner. And it keeps coming out 0. Yes. Rhea nodded slowly. Then stop reckoning and start working. That's the whole trick, Nima. That's the entire thing my species figured out that yours didn't. You don't get to know how it ends. You just get to decide what you're doing right now. She almost smiled. Your people spent 100,000 years so good at predicting the end of things that you forgot the end isn't a fact. It's a rumor. It's the most reliable rumor in the universe, and it's still a rumor. Neither of them slept properly in those 8 days, though for different reasons and in different amounts. Nima did not need to. Rhea could not afford to. They ran on the ship's harsh recycled coffee and a tin of ancient ration bars Vico had left aboard the hauler years before, stale enough that Rhea joked, once, that they were probably older than some of the treaties the Accord had broken. Nima, who did not always understand human humor, laughed anyway, a full second too late, because she had learned somewhere in the last month that laughing late was better than not laughing at all. So they worked. They tried to reach the hearth. The transmission would take 9 days to cross, the last measure had 8. They tried anyway. Rhea recorded it herself, sitting in the cold galley with Nima beside her, and she kept it short, because she had learned on a wall 19 days long that the truest things do not need many words. She said, to whoever hears this in time, there is a weapon, it is real, do not let anyone tell you otherwise, and if you cannot stop it, at least believe the people who could not stop it in time. She did not really expect anyone to hear it before the number ran out. She sent it anyway, because sending it anyway was the entire grammar of her species, and because a message that arrives too late to save anyone can still arrive in time to be believed. They tried to reach the Accord Senate through Nima's remaining channels, and found every channel dead, sealed by Vandermeer with the same quiet thoroughness he had applied to 10,000 years of memory. They tried the Kedmer network, Vico's hidden channels, the last honest thing in the Accord, and this nearly worked, and the nearly was what Nima could not forgive herself for afterward. Vico got the warning to 12 Kedmer work crews inside the custodian operation. 12 crews of welders and engineers who suddenly understood what they were being asked to help wake. 9 of them walked off the job. 9 crews of working people, told the truth by another welder through a network the powerful did not know existed, looked at a 10,000-year-old doomsday and refused to touch it. One of them was a foreman named Belastra, who had spent 13 years maintaining custodian transports without ever once being told what they carried, and who put down her tools in front of a supervisor twice her rank and said, in words that reached Nima secondhand and that she never verified and never doubted, that she had welded hulls for the Accord her whole life without asking what was inside them, and she was finished not asking. She did not run. She did not sabotage anything. She simply stopped, in the oldest and quietest act of refusal there is, and 41 other welders stopped with her inside the hour. None of them were ever punished for it, because by the time anyone with the authority to punish them looked up from the schedule, there was no longer an Accord left organized enough to bother. It was, Nima would say later, the most purely admirable thing she witnessed in 400 years of life. It delayed the last measure by 19 hours. Vico herself was not one of the crews that walked, because Vico was not on the yards any longer. She was 60 light-years away, aboard a hauler that no longer existed on any registry, and she had sent the warning through 5 hands before it ever reached a single welder, each hand a name she trusted with her life and had never once met in person. She would not learn for weeks which of them survived the asking. When she finally did, she learned that 2 of the 5 had been quietly reassigned to postings nobody could later locate, and she added their names to a list of her own, the way Rhea kept the dead of Anvil, and she never once told Nima, because some grief a person keeps to carry for their own species alone. It did not stop it. Because the custodians did not need the Kedmer. They only needed one Velthani with the authority to give the order, and there was one, and he was 600 years old, and he had spent his entire life preparing to be the person who did this so that no one else would have to. Nima reached him. That was the last thing she tried, on the 7th day, and it is the reason this story has any ending at all. She got a transmission through to Oral Vandermeer. And she did not argue with him. She did not plead. She had spent 400 years learning what moves a Velthani mind, and she knew that nothing she could say about mercy or horror would reach a man who had spent 6 centuries drowning in both. So Nima Salrith did the only thing a reckoner has ever been able to do. She sent him the truth. Elon Sero's message. All of it. The vigil. The 1 season. The choice. The mercy. The fence. She sent the old man the thing he had refused to put inside her, and she let it put itself inside him instead. Then she waited. And on the 8th day, at 0400, Oral Vandermeer woke the last measure and fired it into the human arm, exactly as ordered. I want to tell you why he did it, because it is the most important thing in this entire story, and because if you do not understand it you will think this is a story about villains, and it is not, and the fact that it is not is the whole point. Nima had one real chance to stop him in those last 6 hours, and she used it, and it is worth telling you what she said, because it was the only time in this entire war that she spoke to Vandermeer not as a reckoner but as whatever she had become instead. She sent him a single line, unencrypted, undisguised, knowing every custodian channel in the Accord might read it before he did. She wrote, "You told me once that you were the only part of this that could still be persuaded. I am not trying to persuade you with numbers anymore, Oral. I am asking you, as the only friend I have made in 400 years, not to do this. That is all I have left. It is not a reckoning. It is a request." He did not answer that one directly. She would spend the rest of her life deciding whether his silence had been worse than a refusal, and never reach a number she trusted. Vandermeer replied to Nima once, for hours before the firing window. It was not a refusal and it was not an agreement. It was 3 lines, written in his own hand rather than dictated, which Nima would later say was the detail that told her he meant every word of it. He wrote, "You have done what I asked you not to do, Reckoner. You found it, and now I cannot unfind it for you, and soon I will not be able to unfind it for anyone else either. I am sorry. I am going to do the thing I was made for anyway, and I want you to understand, before I do, that I know exactly what that makes me." Nima read it 11 times, the way she had once read 11 words left by a dead reckoner in a sealed archive, and she understood, before she understood anything else about that day, that she was not going to be able to stop him, because a man who already knows precisely what he is cannot be talked out of being it. He was not confused. He was not deceived. He was, in the oldest and most human sense of the phrase, damned, and he was choosing it with his eyes fully open, and there is no argument in the universe that reaches a person once they have arrived there. Oral Vandermeer received Elon Sero's message 6 hours before the firing window. He read it. He understood it completely. He understood that his civilization was alive on human mercy, that it had been left as a fence, that the entire accord was a role assigned to it by a man who had judged his own species and executed it. He understood that the last measure would not save the accord but would guarantee its destruction, because you cannot bury a people who do not break, you can only remove the last reason they have to stop. He understood all of it. Nima's reckoning was perfect. And he fired anyway. He fired because of a thing that Nima had not put in her arithmetic, and it took her a long time to see it, and when she did it broke something in her that never healed. Vandermeer did not fire because he thought it would work. He fired because he had spent 600 years as the sole keeper of the unbearable truth, and Nima had just proved to him that the truth could not be kept. She had found it. A disgraced reckoner, a Kedmer welder, and a human quartermaster had found in 4 weeks the thing his order had buried for 10,000 years. Which meant others would find it. Which meant the accord was going to learn, soon, and completely, that its entire civilization was a fence built by its enemy, that its sacred law was a lie, that it drew every breath by permission. Vandermeer had watched what that knowledge did to one reckoner. He could not imagine what it would do to 100,000 years of certainty across 10,000 worlds. So he chose. Not between mercy and murder. Between 2 endings. In one, the accord learns the truth and comes apart from the inside, not conquered, but dissolved, every species in it looking at each other and understanding that everything there was a gift from a thing that could have killed them and got bored. In the other, the accord dies fighting a monster, believing itself brave, and never learns. Oral Vandermeer fired the last measure to keep his civilization from finding out that it had been spared. He killed 60,000 people on Anvil, and doomed his own species, to protect the accord from a truth he had decided it could not survive. He was, in that moment, doing exactly what the accord had done 10,000 years ago. He was choosing the comfortable lie over the unbearable fact, and calling it protection, and he was one more in an unbroken chain of good people making that same choice, and it was the choice that killed them all. Nima Salrith watched the last measure fire from 4 light hours away, and she wept, Velfani do weep, rarely, and it is a terrible thing to see, and then she did something she had never done in 400 years. She stopped reckoning. She stopped calculating the end. And she turned to the human beside her and asked, for the first time in her long life, what they should do right now. Humanity's reply took 9 days to organize, and it was the most terrifying thing the galaxy had seen in 10,000 years, and the terrifying part was not the violence. It was the speed. It was the unanimity. It was the sheer, effortless, joyful relief with which 11 billion people stopped arguing. Understand what the accord had done. For 2 centuries, humanity had been a scatter of quarrelsome colonies, a homeworld coalition that could barely agree on trade tariffs, a species so disorganized that the accord had rated it a minor administrative matter. There were factions. There were people who wanted peace. There were whole worlds that had argued, right up to the 8th day, that the war was a frontier problem and not worth the cost. There was, in short, a civilization, messy, divided, arguing, alive. There was a woman named Counselor Yeva Tran, who represented a cluster of pacifist agricultural worlds called the Sowing, and who had spent 4 months standing on the floor of the Hearth Coalition arguing, respectfully and at length, that humanity's war footing was already too aggressive, that Rhea Maddox's own warnings about Tessely Crossing proved her point exactly, She was, by every account, principled, careful, and not remotely a coward. On the 9th day after Anvil, E04 stood up again, and this time she did not argue for restraint. She moved, formally, to grant Aldous Vane emergency authority over the whole of the Hearth fleet, unopposed, and she offered no explanation for the reversal, because there was nothing to explain that 11 seconds of sensor footage had not already said better than she could. Nobody who watched her do it ever accused her of hypocrisy. That was the part that frightened Rhea most, when she heard about it later. It had not looked like a betrayal of anyone's principles. It had looked like waking up. The last measure erased Anvil in 11 seconds, and it erased humanity's disagreements in 9 days. Every faction folded into one. Every argument ended. The people who had wanted peace wanted it no longer, and they did not have to be persuaded, and that was the horror, nobody had to persuade anyone of anything. The Accord had spent 100,000 years perfecting the art of applying exactly enough force to make a species yield, and it had applied that art to the one species in the galaxy where force does not produce yielding, it produces unity. They had taken a quarrelsome, divided, fundamentally reasonable people and, in 11 seconds, given them the one thing they had never had and the one thing that made them lethal. They gave humanity a reason. Aldous Vane, the reasonable man from Tesseley Crossing, was made Marshal of the Hearth Fleet by acclamation within a week. There was no vote worth the name. He stood up in front of the coalition and said the words that would be carved into 100 monuments and would damn his species: "They have shown us what they are. Let us show them." And humanity answered. On 100 worlds, recruitment stations that had spent months quietly turning away volunteers for lack of ships to put them on found lines around the block by the second morning. On a colony called Reisman's Hollow, the world that had tried to hold a wall the way Anvil had and had not held it, the world whose dead child's drawing Oduya had once carried folded in his coat, every surviving adult who could still walk registered for service in a single afternoon, and the recruiting officer, a tired woman with too few forms, wrote in her log that she had never once had to ask anybody why. Rhea Maddox watched it happen from a stolen ship crossing back into human space, and she recognized it, and the recognition made her sick, because she had heard it before. She had heard it 4 days earlier in a 10,000-year-old recording. The vigil had not become the sea because humans are cruel. It had become the sea because the Accord had pushed a species that cannot break until the only thing left in it was momentum. Elon Sorrow had watched it happen once. And now Rhea Maddox was the only living human who knew that this had a name, and a precedent, and an ending, and that the ending was that humanity would win everything and then have to decide whether to execute itself again. She was the only one who knew. And she was, at that moment, a woman with no rank, no world, no proof, and a daughter she believed was dead. For 11 days, Rhea Maddox did not know whether Nell was alive, and I have to tell you what those 11 days did to her, because this is the part of the story where the conscience of humanity nearly stopped being won. Anvil was gone. There was no wreckage to search, no bodies to count, no survivors to interview, because the last measure did not leave any of those things. There was only an absence and a list of who had been on the world when it folded. And the list was incomplete, because the list was always incomplete, because Anvil had been a working colony with ships coming and going, and nobody in the chaos of a war could say with certainty who had been standing on that rock at 0400 on the 8th day. Nell's name was on the rolls. Nell's name was also on a partial evacuation manifest from 6 days earlier, unconfirmed, one of 4,000 names on a document nobody had finished verifying because the person responsible for verifying it had been on Anvil. That manifest existed at all because of a decision Admiral Sefa Oduya had made quietly, on his own authority, the day after Rhea crossed the lines, not because he believed her, not entirely, but because he had run traffic numbers he could not otherwise explain, and because he was a man who had learned, watching her hold a wall for 19 days, that the cost of being wrong about a warning is rarely symmetrical. He ordered a partial, deniable evacuation of dependents from a short list of high-visibility frontier worlds, Anvil first among them, and he told almost no one why, and he logged it as a routine rotation so that no committee could vote it down before it was already done. It was the only precaution the entire war produced that actually worked, and Oduya would spend the rest of his career refusing to take credit for it, because the 6 days it bought Nell Maddox were also 6 days he could not explain or justify to the billions of people whose worlds he had not evacuated. So Rhea Maddox spent 11 days holding both. Her daughter was dead. Her daughter was alive. Both were true, at the same time, for 11 days, and there was nothing she could do about either. She kept moving, because stillness let the two truths collide, and the collision was unbearable. She reorganized the Constance cargo manifest twice, though nobody had asked her to and though she had no authority over it, because counting crates was a thing her hands could do while the rest of her waited, and because she had learned, long before Anvil, that grief left alone in an idle body finds worse things to do than count crates. There was a habit she caught herself in, somewhere around the fourth day, that she did not have a name for until she remembered where she had seen it before. She would be moving through the Constance corridors, and she would stop, without deciding to, and turn, and confirm that some fixed point was still where she had left it, a particular crate, the small dented locker where she kept the one photograph of Nell she was not supposed to have carried across the lines. Confirm it. Then go back to what she had been doing. It took her 3 days to place it, because she had spent so long watching her daughter do exactly this in the dark under the cargo terminals that she had never once imagined the habit could travel the other direction, from the child up into the mother. She was checking. She had become, in 11 days without an answer, the very thing she had once promised a 9-year-old she would never have to be. She told no one. There was no one on the Constant who would have understood what she was checking for. And in those 11 days, she understood her own species from the inside in a way that no recording could have taught her. Because she wanted it. She wanted what Aldous Vane wanted. She sat in the dark with the two truths in her hands and she found, underneath the grief, a clean and enormous and almost beautiful rage, and it had a shape, and the shape was, they took a 9-year-old girl who checked to see if her mother was still in the room, and they erased her out of the universe with a committee vote and a midday meal, and there is not one thing in this galaxy that they own that I would not take from them for it. That was Rhea Maddox. The wall. The conscience. The one who was supposed to hold the line against her own people. That was what was in her, 11 days after Anvil, and she found it there fully formed, requiring no effort at all. She understood then what Elon's sorrow had meant. We are not a cruel people. We are simply incapable of stopping. It was not a moral failing you could scold out of someone. It was not something that happened to bad humans. It was in her, in the best person she knew how to be, the instant they took the thing she loved, and the only reason it had not swallowed her was the sheerest accident of timing. She had heard Sarah's message 4 days before Anvil died. 4 days. If the order had come the other way around, if Anvil had folded before she opened that data core, Rhea Maddox would have been standing at Aldous Vane's right hand, and she would have been magnificent, and the galaxy would have burned. That is how thin it was. 4 days. The entire future of every living thing in the galaxy came down to which of two messages a tired woman happened to receive first. On the 11th day, a Kedma relay, Vico's network, the welders, the last honest thing in the Accord, passing a human evacuation manifest hand to hand across enemy lines because a shipwright decided it mattered, confirmed that Nell Maddox had been lifted off Anvil 6 days before the world folded, and was alive, on a transport, 400 light-years away, asleep in a room with a window. Priya's name was on the same manifest, 2 lines below her daughter's, and it was the first thing Rhea checked after Nell's, because some debts a person keeps without ever being asked to. Rhea Maddox read it, and put her face in her hands for exactly 30 seconds, which was all she allowed herself. And then she got up, because she had just been handed back the one thing that made it possible for her to choose, and she knew exactly how few people in her species had been given that gift, and she understood that this made her the only human alive who could do what had to be done. Here is the problem that Rhea Maddox and Nema Salrath turned over between them for 19 days while a human fleet crossed the galaxy, and it is the finest problem in this entire story, because there is no good answer to it and they both knew it. They had left the stolen Kedmar hauler behind by then, transferred under guard to a Hearth cruiser called the Constant, whose crew did not know what to do with an enemy reckoner walking their corridors, and settled, after an awkward first week, into a kind of wary courtesy that was its own quiet miracle. Nobody spat at her. Nobody struck her. Twice a young rating brought her a share of his own rations without being asked, because he had heard she did not eat much, and he had decided, entirely on his own, that this was a kindness and not a weakness. Rhea noticed these small mercies more than she let on. They were the only proof she had, in those 19 days, that Nema's fear of what humanity might become was not yet a certainty. Rhea had Elon Saro's message. It was the only weapon she had. And she could not decide whether using it would save the galaxy or end it. Think it through the way they did. If she broadcast it, gave humanity back the memories Sorrow had taken, then every human alive would learn the truth. They would learn that they had done this before. They would learn that the Vigil had won everything in one season, and that a voice of their own species had looked at what they were and had killed his own civilization to protect the galaxy from it. Rhea's hope was that this knowledge was a wall. That a species which knows it has stood here before, and knows what it chose, might choose differently. Might find, in the memory, the break it does not have in its blood. Nima's reckoning was colder, and it was the reason they argued for 19 days. You are assuming they will hear the ending, Nima said. They will hear the beginning. Rhea, listen to what you are about to broadcast to 11 billion enraged people who have just watched a world erased. You are going to tell them that 10,000 years ago, humanity fought this same empire and unmade it in a single season. You are going to tell them that they are not the underdogs, that they never were, that they are the second attempt at something that already won. You believe they will hear a warning. I have reckoned 9 worlds, and I am telling you that a frightened, grieving people does not hear a warning. It hears permission. Rhea pushed back once, before she gave up pushing. So we do nothing. We let them go in blind, the way Saro's people went in blind, and hope somebody remembers this differently the next time. I did not say do nothing, Nima said. I said this is not nothing. There is no neutral choice sitting on a shelf waiting for you, Rhea. Silence is also an action. You are not choosing between telling them and staying out of it. You are choosing between 2 ways of shaping what they become, and you do not get to feel clean about either one. Then I'm not going to pick the one that keeps me clean, Rhea said. I'm going to pick the one that doesn't end with somebody like you deciding it for the rest of us, in a locked room, 1,000 years from now. And the terrible thing was that Nima was right, and Rhea knew she was right, and Rhea did it anyway. But not for the reason you think. She did it because of the last 4 words of Nima's argument, and because of what they revealed about the Reckoner herself. You want to withhold the truth, Rhea said slowly, because you have calculated that my people cannot be trusted with it. Nima said nothing. That's it. That's the whole thing. That's what your people did 10,000 years ago. Rhea's voice was not angry. That was what made it land. Vandermeer fired a doomsday to keep your civilization from finding out it had been spared, because he decided they couldn't handle it. Sorrow took my species' memory away because he decided we couldn't be trusted with it. Your Senate voted to bury 11 billion people at a committee meeting because they decided we were an exception that couldn't be allowed. Nima, every single catastrophe in this story, for 10,000 years, was caused by somebody good deciding that everyone else couldn't handle the truth. Everyone. That's the pattern. That's the actual enemy. It's not the Accord and it's not humanity. It's the decision, made by the wisest person in the room, that the rest of us have to be protected from what's real. She stood up. Sorrow was the best of us and he was wrong. He didn't save the galaxy. He just bought it 10,000 years and made sure we'd walk into the exact same room without a map. If he'd told us, if he'd left us the memory instead of taking it, maybe we'd have grown up knowing what we are. Maybe Anvil never happens. Maybe none of this happens. She looked down at the oldest, wisest, most careful being she had ever met. You want me to make his mistake again? I'd rather be wrong out loud than right in secret. I'm done with people deciding what the rest of US can hold. And Nima Salrath, 400 years old, the finest reckoner of her generation, who had spent her entire life being the person in the room who knew best, looked at a quartermaster from a dead rock and found that she had no counter-argument at all. Then you had better be right, she said. No, said Rhea. I'd better be honest. Right isn't mine to promise. The Accord did not fight the Hearth fleet. That is the thing the histories will struggle with. It tried, for 12 days, and then it stopped trying, and the reason it stopped is a single Orisk. Fleet Marshal Davin Creel had been the man who lost Anvil. He had spent the year since that defeat in the particular hell reserved for soldiers who have failed at the only thing they know how to do, and he had been given, as a mercy, a quiet command at a supply depot far from anything that mattered. And when the Hearth fleet came through his sector on its way to the Accord's core worlds, Davin Creel had 7 capital ships and a clear order to engage and delay. He had also, 3 days earlier, received a transmission from a disgraced reckoner, the same reckoner whose warning he had once waved off, above Anvil, with 4 words that would follow him for the rest of his life: "They are 60,000 farmers on a rock. They will break. Everything breaks." Creel read Elon Sero's message. He was not a philosopher. He was a soldier of 40 years, and he had exactly one skill, which was the honest assessment of a battlefield, and he applied it now to the largest battlefield any Orisk had ever been asked to assess. And what he saw was this: his civilization had fired a doomsday at a species that does not break, in order to make it stop, and it had not made it stop, and now that species was coming, and every ship he put in front of it would not delay it by an hour. It would only give them another reason. He had watched 60,000 farmers hold a wall for 19 days against everything he had. He knew, in the only way a soldier can know, exactly what was coming, and he knew that nothing in the Accord's arsenal or doctrine or 100,000-year certainty could do anything about it except make it worse. He read the message twice more that night, alone in a depot office that still smelled faintly of machine oil from a supply run he had not wanted, and he thought about a sentence he had once said above Anvil that a reckoner had tried to warn him away from, and about the 60,000 people who had proved him wrong in the worst possible way, and about how a soldier who cannot admit an old mistake is a soldier who will make it again at a larger scale, with more lives attached to it. He kept, in a drawer of that office, a single burned fragment of hull plating recovered from one of his own ships above Anvil. He had never told anyone why he kept it, and no one had ever asked. That night he took it out and set it on the desk in front of him while he made the hardest decision of his life, because he had decided a long time ago that he owed the dead at least the courtesy of deciding things in front of them. So Fleet Marshal Davin Creel disobeyed the only order that had ever mattered. He did not fight. He moved his 7 capital ships out of the corridor, and he opened a channel to the Hearth fleet, and he broadcast, in the clear, on every frequency, in human speech, the following: "This is Fleet Marshal Creel of the Accord. I commanded at Anvil. I was wrong about your people in every way a soldier can be wrong. I will not put my ships in front of you, because I have nothing that will stop you, and I will not spend Orisk lives buying my Senate one more hour of pretending otherwise. The corridor is open. I am standing aside." A pause. "I ask one thing. When you reach our worlds, remember that the people who voted for the last measure are 11 very old beings in one chamber, and there are 10,000 worlds behind them that were never asked." It was the first time in 100,000 years that an Accord Marshal had refused an order, and it broke something open. Not everywhere. Not most places. But 7 ships became 40, and 40 became 160, and across the Accord's collapsing front, Orisk commanders who had spent their lives inside a doctrine began to step out of the corridor and stand aside, and the Kedmar work crews walked off the yards, and the Sibrin auditors reported a mood in the swarm that had no name. One of the 40 was a young commander named Threl Basarith, 3 months into her first independent posting, who had never met Creel and had no personal reason to trust him. She read his broadcast twice, checked it against nothing because there was nothing left to check it against, and made the decision alone, in about 4 minutes, that would define the rest of her life. She did not stand her ships aside for Creel. She stood them aside, she said afterward, for a version of herself 20 years older that she did not want to become, an old marshal explaining to a room of strangers, with perfect professional calm, exactly how many farmers it would take to break. It was not obedience that spread through the Accord's collapsing front in those last days. It was recognition. Every officer who stood down had, in some private hour of their own service, already met the shape of the thing Creel was refusing, and had simply been waiting for permission to say so out loud. And the great machine that had governed 4/5 of the galaxy for 100,000 years did not fall. It simply stopped agreeing to run. And Nema Salrath, watching from a small stolen ship, understood the last piece of Elon Sero's reckoning, and it was the piece that gave her hope for the first time since Anvil. Sorrow had left the Accord alive to be a wall for humanity. He had failed. The Accord had not been a wall, it had been a mirror, and it had shown humanity nothing but its own reflection until humanity swung at it. But something else had happened that Sorrow could not have predicted, 10,000 years ago, because it had not existed then. The Accord had welders. It had auditors. It had marshals who had lost. It had ordinary people down the whole long chain of the empire who had never been asked, and who, when the truth reached them through a network of shipwrights, had done the one thing their own doctrine said no species ever does without being forced. They had stopped. On their own. Because it was wrong. The Accord had spent 100,000 years believing that nothing stops unless you make it. And in the last 12 days of its existence as an empire, it discovered that it had been wrong about itself, too. Among the Sibren, the swarm-minded auditors who had felt the fleet above Anvil shudder a year before anyone with rank admitted it was shuddering, the mood that moved through the shared consciousness in the days after the last measure fired had, for the first time in the swarm's long service to the Accord, something close to a name. It translated, roughly, across every attempt any Velthani linguist ever made at it, as shame that has stopped waiting to be told it is allowed. An old auditor filed a single report to a command structure that no longer had anyone reading its incoming traffic. The swarm would no longer certify the tally for any fleet, anywhere, because the tally had been built to measure the moment an enemy breaks, and the swarm had just watched its own civilization fail to do that first. No one answered the report. No one was left, by then, whose job it was to answer. The Hearth fleet reached the Accord's core worlds on the 40th day after Anvil, and there was nothing in front of it. That is how it ended, and it is the cruelest possible way it could have ended, because the Accord surrender took away the only thing that might have saved it. If they had fought, humanity would have had an enemy. Instead the Accord's core lay open, 10,000 worlds, 4/5 of the galaxy, the Velthani homeworld with its great pale Senate chamber, 11 very old beings who had voted for the last measure over a committee agenda and then broken for the midday meal. No fleet. No defense. Nothing but people. Aldous Vane had the authority to end them. All of them. The Hearth had given it to him by acclamation, and humanity, unified for the first time in its history by an act of erasure, was behind him to the last soul. There was no vote to be had. There was no faction to object. Every human alive had watched a world of 60,000 fold out of the universe in 11 seconds, and every human alive had arrived at the same answer, and the answer was the one Elon Sorrow had heard from every advisor he had, 10,000 years ago, standing in this exact place. And Rhea Maddox flew a small stolen Kedmer hauler into the middle of the largest human fleet ever assembled, with a 400-year-old Velthani beside her, and asked for 20 minutes. They gave it to her. Not because they agreed. Because she was Anvil. Because the woman asking had lost her world and had believed her daughter dead for 11 days and had every reason to want what they wanted. Because Aldous Vane, whatever else he was not a coward, and he was willing to be argued with in front of everyone. That was the last decency left in the human command, and it was enough, and it was the only reason any of this had a chance. Word of the 20 minutes went out ahead of her across the fleet's open channels, ship to ship, the way news always traveled fastest through a military that had learned, at Anvil, not to trust anything that came only from the top. By the time Rhea stood up, every vessel in the largest human fleet ever assembled had gone quiet enough to hear a single voice, and on 100 bridges, crews who had spent 9 days screaming for blood found themselves, without quite deciding to, holding their breath instead. She did not argue. She had thought about it for 19 days and she had understood that there was no argument to make. Rage does not lose arguments, it does not have them. Nima stood just behind her shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing left for a reckoner to calculate. For the first time in 400 years she had no projection running, no tally, no column counting down toward a break point that did not exist. She simply watched a human being get ready to speak, the way you watch weather arrive, and understood that whatever the galaxy was about to become would be decided in the next few minutes by a woman she had once helped condemn to a burning wall. On one of the 100 bridges listening, a young loader named Casimiro Yellerin, who had grown up 2 systems from Anvil and had never fired a weapon before the war found him, stood with his hand resting on a console he did not need to touch, and found that he was praying, in the old half-forgotten way his grandmother had taught him, for a woman he had never met to say something that would let him go home still recognizing himself. He was not alone in it. It was there, on every ship, in the seconds before Rhea Maddox spoke, 10,000 small private hopes, none of them asked for, all pointed at the same open channel. So Rhea Maddox broadcast Elon Sorrow. She put the voice of a man 10,000 years dead onto every channel of the human fleet, and onto every Accord frequency, and into the open sky of the Velthani homeworld, and she let both civilizations hear the thing that both of them had spent 10,000 years being protected from. She let them hear the vigil. The one season. The empire unmade. She let humanity hear that they had done this before and had won everything, and she let them hear, Nima had been right, this was the risk, this was the whole terrible gamble, exactly how easy it had been. And then she let them hear the rest. She let 11 billion enraged people, and 10,000 defenseless worlds, hear a human being standing exactly where Aldous Vane was standing, with the knife at the throat of the galaxy, saying, "We are not a cruel people. We were simply incapable of stopping." And she let them hear him do it anyway. She let them hear him take his own species' empire apart with his own hands and hand his grandchildren a hole where their history should have been, because he loved them too much to let them find out what they were. And when it was finished, Rhea Maddox spoke once, on every channel, in the flat exhausted voice she had once used to read a list of the dead to an enemy fleet. She said, "He was the best of us, and he was wrong. He didn't trust us with the truth. So he took it, and we walked right back into this room 10,000 years later with no idea we'd ever been here." She paused. "I'm not going to do that to you. You get the truth. All of it. You get to know exactly what we are and exactly what we did last time and exactly what's in front of us right now, which is 10,000 worlds of people who never got asked. And then you get to choose. Not him. Not me. You. I'm not asking you to be merciful. I'm asking you to be the first humans in 10,000 years who got to decide this with our eyes open. That's all. That's the whole thing. Anvil held 19 days because everybody there chose it, one at a time, in the dark, with no one watching. So choose." And then Rhea Maddox cut the channel, and sat down, and put her hands in her lap, because there was nothing else left that she could do. We do not know what they chose. That is not a trick and it is not a cheat. It is the truth of where this story stands, because the choice is not being made by a fleet or a marshal or a woman from a rock called Anvil. It is being made right now, in 11 billion separate rooms, one human being at a time, exactly the way it was made on a wall 19 days deep with nobody watching. That is the only way humanity has ever decided anything that mattered. It cannot be ordered. It cannot be reckoned. Nima Salrith has run it 400 times and the answer will not resolve, and for the first time in her 400 years, the finest reckoner of her generation is glad that a number will not come. Here is what we know. We know the Accord is finished as an empire, and that it was not humanity that ended it. It was a welder who walked off a job. An auditor who felt a mood with no name. A marshal who had lost at Anvil and had learned the one thing his civilization never taught him, that you can stop because it is wrong, and no one has to make you. The Accord did not fall. It looked at itself and declined to continue, and in doing so it disproved its own sacred law in the last hours of its life, and there is a mercy in that which Elon Sarro, 10,000 years ago, never imagined and could not have counted on. We know that Rhea Maddox gave her species back its memory, and that this was either the bravest thing any human has ever done or the last mistake our kind will ever make, and that she did it not because she calculated it would work but because she had decided that she would rather be wrong out loud than right in secret. She is a quartermaster. It is the only thing she has ever really believed, that you do not get to decide for other people what they can carry. And we know that 400 light-years away, a 9-year-old girl named Nell Maddox is asleep in a room with a window, alive, on a world that still exists, and that she does not yet know that her mother is the reason the galaxy is still there. Or isn't. We will find out together. But there is one more thing, and it is the thread that runs underneath all of it, and it has been waiting since the moment Nima Salrith cracked open a data core in the grave of an ancient war. Elon Sarro's message had a second passage. Encrypted separately. In a cipher that is not human, and not Accord, and not anything in 100,000 years of galactic record. The man who took his species' memory away, who left nothing hidden from his own descendants because he wanted them to find everything he chose to leave, that man hid one thing. On purpose. From someone. And Nima Salrith has decoded a second line of it. The first line, you already know. It says, they were not the reason we stopped. The second line says, we stopped because it was watching, and it only notices the ones that get loud. 10,000 years ago, humanity stood over the galaxy with the power to take all of it, and a man named Elon Sorrow burned his own civilization to the ground and told his people it was because of what they were becoming. He was telling the truth. He was just not telling all of it. There was something else out there. Something that made the greatest human civilization in history choose to become small, and silent, and forgotten, and to leave the Accord alive as a wall, not to protect the galaxy from humanity. To keep humanity quiet. And Ria Maddox has just broadcast the loudest thing our species has said in 10,000 years, on every frequency, into the open sky.